Hi, I'm Naira Antoun, Director of the Transnational Trends and Citizenship project, and you are listening to Order from Ashes, the podcast from Century International. This podcast comes out of the Transnational Trends and Citizenship project, where we brought together topic experts from across different regions to see what we could learn across region. Today, I'll be speaking with Thanassis Cambanis about the project as a whole. Hi, Thanassis.
Hi, Naira. Great to be on the podcast with you to talk about our project.
Thanks for joining. All right. So how about we start with a very sort of big picture idea of what this project was?
Sure. And we started working on this about 2 years ago, right around the time that the pandemic was breaking over the world, and we were really thinking about a series of interlocked global crises that we saw as being really deeply related, and which, at least our feeling at the time, was it was a new idea, especially in the West, for people to understand their crises as being part of something international. And I'm very specifically thinking of things like the democracy deficit, the erosion of democracy, the intrusion of armed groups into political life, the sense that old battles about equal rights or gender equality or social justice had been won, and then suddenly these things were being questioned again. Old fights about race and police violence and accountability and lots more. And also the sense that protest, which at least in the West was thought of as an old tool that maybe had outlived its usefulness or had peaked in the 60s or early 70s. And then we had seen protest become the major currency of politics around the world, first in the Arab world, but then also in Hong Kong. And that was suddenly coming up in the United States and Europe as a major force. And our starting question was, how can we understand these crises as being interconnected, either part of single global phenomena or as somehow things that were affecting each other, learning from each other, and driving each other around the world?
So, I mean, part of the thinking around what this crisis or set of crises looked like was also, I guess, over the last decade has been around like rising authoritarianism across different parts of the globe. And it's been hard not to think about that in some ways as a global phenomenon, right? Like in Europe, there are concerns about rising authoritarianism in Latin America. So, I mean, there has been beginnings of some global thinking around that, right?
Absolutely, and there have. By the way, we're not claiming to have sort of invented this approach, right? There have always been people, activists, thinkers, political players, and others who have always had this mindset. But writ large, both of us, me and you, Naira, have been rooted for much of our adult lives in events happening in the Middle East and North Africa. And for me especially, it was interesting to see as I'm a person who grew up in the United States, spent most of my adult life in the Arab world, and covering, among other things, the outcome of America's destructive war on terror wars, the invasion of Iraq, super militarized counterterrorism policy, and so on, and the war in Syria. I mean, the list is long. But what was interesting was to see suddenly in the United States around the Trump era, from 2017 onward, Americans suddenly seeing what people in the Arab world and the Middle East had experienced and realizing, oh my, we're experiencing some of these things too. Maybe we're not exceptional and completely immune to the forces that are playing out in other places. Maybe those events, those wars and rights stripping and oppression that are going on in the Arab world aren't some kind of unique Arab pathology, but are some kind of contingent political phenomenon, and now we're experiencing it too. And we wanted, among other things, to say, okay, there's this habit of trying to have Westerners go and teach Middle Easterners how to deal with things. What if we just flip that versely on its head and say, hey, Western Europe and North America. You have a lot to learn from the Middle East and North Africa. How about we bring people together who deal with related phenomena, with the initial framing being, what can the West learn from the East instead of the other way around?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to suggest either that we had invented a new paradigm, nor that necessarily the thinking around, let's take the same example of rising authoritarianism, was necessarily happening in a very analytical way. I mean, sometimes those comparisons to the Middle East would happen in quite a facile way, right? Like, oh, this type of leader is, familiar to us from Saudi Arabia. Just as, when there was suppression of protests in the US and Europe, you had these sort of comments of like, oh, this looks more like Baghdad. So we expect, so the type of comparisons. So we hope to look quite deeply and move beyond that kind of, sort of surface level.
That's exactly right. I think, and we'll talk more about this in this podcast, there are helpful and unhelpful ways of setting up comparisons and looking at things in an international context. And, this is something we had a lot of experience and struggle with in an earlier iteration of this citizenship work, where we were asking questions about rights, citizenship, quality of citizenship, rights for minorities, rights for different groups of people. And we found we had to be really careful. If we talked about universal rights in a certain way, it actually erased the specifics and particularities of communities, LGBTQ people in Egypt, or Christians in Iraq, or secular people in Lebanon, or you name it, powerful groups, marginalized groups. It turns out if you talk in very simple terms or absolute terms about universalism, it removes complexity and truth that's necessary to understand what's happening. And at the same time, if you relinquish any effort to find the universal or find the commonalities, you also miss a ton of dynamics and a ton of important forces. And that's the sort of sweet spot that we tried to aim this project at. And I think one of the most fascinating things is how hard it is. If you do decide, okay, this is what we want to do. We want to find out what we can learn by juxtaposing, let's say, experts in protest in the Middle East with experts in protest in the U.S. And at the same time, so you sort of force them to work in concert on thinking about their different problems without suggesting that you're trying to set up an equivalency or making any assumptions at all, really, about, you're just asking the question, are there interrelations? Are there comparisons to be made? And I'd be remiss in not saying one thing about the genesis of the way we talked about this project, and it's a sort of a bit of a joke that's been overtaken by the depth and seriousness of our inquiry. But Carl Sharrow, the brilliant but also hilarious analyst and satirist, had a tweet some years ago where he said, we're always hearing people talk about MENA, Middle East and North Africa. Let's start talking about WENA, Western Europe and North America. And it was, I think, meant to be a silly poke at how reductionist and absurd it is to take this huge world region that goes from Morocco to Iran, or arguably Afghanistan, and north-south from Turkey to Saudi Arabia, and includes places like Somalia and Sudan in some people's mindsets, and to just call that MENA, like, what could this huge swath of the globe possibly have in common? And no more than the WENA does, from the Ukraine to California. And I thought that was funny, but also useful, because there are some commonalities, and since we do think sometimes in these kinds of broad terms, let's do it in all directions and not just when we're talking about the Arab world or the Middle East.
Yeah, no, I think this project both sort of brings a couple of regions alongside each other to look at one another, broadly defined regions, the Middle East and the US and Europe. At the same time, as with Carl Sharrow's comment, it sort of pokes at what do we mean by region in the first place, right? Before we go any further, I think, into some of the learnings of the project, and its conceptual framework. Perhaps we should just go through what we say we brought people together, but around what did we bring them together? So you've mentioned protest. That was one of the groups, but perhaps you could just tell us a bit about the different groups.
Sure. So we thought about all these different elements of the global crisis, and we ended up focusing on 4 that we thought were the most ripe for testing this method around. So first was militias or armed groups, which are particularly salient, especially after January 6th in the United States and have been for quite some time in the Middle East. The second was gender and sexuality, which again have been very, very prominent elements of the contestation of power, first during the Arab uprisings of 2010 and 11, and in the U.S. through the culture wars that have really dominated political life here, I would say, for 30 years. The third was police accountability. It was very striking at the time that we were designing this project that the BLM protests were the Black Lives Matters protests were one of the most salient forces in American politics. There were protests about police violence and accountability in Europe throughout this time. And in the Arab world, in particular, this had been a central driving force of the uprisings, and it was police brutality in Tunisia and Egypt specifically and directly that provoked 2 revolutions that for a time overthrew entire despotic governments. And the final one was protest. And to us, that was the most sort of obvious framework within which to think about transnational or transregional comparisons, because there were so many obvious instances of emulation, learning, communication between protest movements in different spaces, and protest had become such a central tool of politics and contestation of politics at this time. The other sorry, I'm going on a little too long, but the other thing that we you and I worked really mindfully on in this project was to bring together different types of thinkers, right? So traditionally in working groups like this, at least, at a think tank, it tends to be think tank people. So they might be ex-government officials, or they might be ex-activists or ex-academics, but they are, in the moment when they're doing these kinds of projects, they are think tank people who are, trying to operate at that sort of practical spot of what are, policy solutions or practicable solutions. And we wanted to have those types of thinkers, but also to have folks who were very much academics, so they're who were outright engaged in theoretical frameworks and understanding concepts or changing concepts around this and teaching them, and activists. So people who are like policy think tank folks, concerned with changing the political state of play, but much more from a ground up engaging in power struggles or struggles with the political space. So we had these 3 very different types of folks that we were bringing together into these thematic groups.
Yeah, so certainly there was a lot of bringing people together who don't normally or wouldn't usually or otherwise speak with one another. So both across area and content of what it is they're working on, and in terms of ways of working and ways of thinking. So there was a lot of, crossing boundaries happening there. I think that what was quite key in the genesis of the project and continued to be throughout is, this idea that the Middle East is exceptionalized, right? So in terms of some of the themes you were talking about earlier, seeing them as global crises, those are things that have been long associated with the Middle East, right? Like particularly authoritarian and particularly misogynistic, particularly wrought by violence. And that's something that perhaps you want to say a little bit about the project, how the project approached that.
I think we both have a lot to say about exceptionalism. That's been, tearing down exceptionalism has been a central part of my intellectual project and intellectual life. For as long as I've been thinking about power and politics. As an American, one is imbued from from the earliest consciousness with the idea of American exceptionalism, right? Whether it's manifest destiny or the special democracy that the special liberalism that the United States believes itself to have. The United States is a sort of light, city on a hill, a light unto nations. This is like very much in the fabric, even one I've come to realize among people who are critics of American power. Americans who are critics of American power, of the American government, still tend to reflect this idea that America is special and different and maybe operates under different laws or has a different claim to moral goodness, so even its mistakes are somehow different than the mistakes of other great powers. Now, when we talk about the exceptionalism of the Middle East, I tend to think about the exceptionalism that outsiders falsely imbue it with, but we can also talk about whether the Middle East carries its own, or countries and communities within the Middle East maybe carry some of their own versions of the exceptionalism that I was just talking about with America. But from the outside, so the Middle East as a region was invented not by people in the Middle East, right? It was invented by cartographers and imperialists who had things to do, usually military projects, later economic projects, in this region that they were occupying and colonizing. So that's just a sort of historical fact. And it's led to this very interesting set of ideas that has really major real world consequences, right? So first is thinking about the Middle East as a unified region at all. And the more you look into this, the more you realize, the State Department and the US military have different definitions of the Middle East. Britain, the UK Foreign Office with its Near East, which is what it calls the Middle East, has a slightly different definition, and so on. So depending on who you're talking about, the Middle East is a different region. And it was more or less defined by military adventures by Western powers in this region. Ultimately, military actions that were there to secure the passage of trade through the Suez Canal, and then later the control of energy resources when oil was discovered. So that's what the Middle East is. Now, once you think about it that way, it's not surprising that there's a ton of mostly racist essentialism around what is the Middle East. The Middle East is this violent place, the thinking goes, that is, because of Islam, because of backwardness, because of tribalism. So the emphasis shifts at times and depending on the speaker, but because of these sort of inchoate forces that have to do with just who these people are, the region is poorly governed or ungovernable. It is hostile to democracy. It is hostile to women. Nowadays, we'd say it's hostile to queer people, LGBTQ plus communities, because of something about who these people are in the Middle East. And it is therefore consigned to these endless cycle of low-grade wars. Now, this kind of rhetoric, by the way, you can hear in the West. If you look historically, you can hear it about many different regions at different times, right? I mean, you heard things like this said about the Balkans in the 90s. You hear things said about this, like this about Africa, on the democracy, like, doomed to not be democratic. That used to be a widely used trope about Asia in the United States. They used to talk about how Asians were somehow supposedly culturally not suited to democracy, and then that suddenly fell apart when lots of Asian countries became democratic, and of course these are racist tropes, and they have a huge amount of power in determining policy.
Right, and then by bringing people together across these two regions, it necessarily sort of invokes a different paradigm, which we'll discuss in, I think, more detail. Okay, we'll be right back.
I'm Thanassis Cambanis, director of Century International. We're the heirs to more than 100 years of international policy research at the Century Foundation. Today, we focus on the human consequences of policy crises in the Middle East and North Africa, and we try to address our findings to a wide international audience. We're especially concerned with decision makers, whether in MENA region capitals or in the West and Washington, whose decisions can greatly change the trajectory of policies in the Middle East. Please visit us at tcf.org to read our reports and listen to our podcasts.
Welcome back to Order from Ashes, the Century International podcast. I'm Naira Antoun, and I'm speaking with Thanassis Cambanis about our project, Transnational Trends in Citizenship. Welcome back, Thanassis.
It's so great to be talking to you about this.
Yeah, this is fun. So perhaps now we can talk, we've spoken in quite sort of big picture way. Maybe we can go into some of the learnings from across our we called them working groups when we were doing the project, but should we do that, Thanassis?
Yeah, let's. I mean, there's so. I mean, by the way, listeners, me and Naira, as we record this podcast, are in the middle of editing like tens and tens of thousands of words that came out of these working groups. I think 17 or 18 long written pieces of content. So we're very, very immersed right now in all the different discussions that took place over almost a year and a half that we've been working on this set of questions.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is the introductory podcast episode we're going to have others coming out of these working groups where we will discuss these learnings in a bit more detail. So for now, just in a general sense, perhaps we'll start with the militias group. I almost want to say militias in scare quotes, because I know there was a lot of discussion around terminology actually in that group. Yeah.
Sure. So that was a really neat exercise, because what we did was we got together a group of folks who we've been working with for a long time at Century International on various conflicts in the Middle East. So we had folks who focused on militias and armed groups in Yemen, in Iraq, and in Syria, and to a lesser extent Lebanon. So like these emblematic hybrid battlegrounds where there are, state, non-state actors, quasi-state actors, states within a state, and so on. And then we brought them together with folks who've been studying the white supremacist groups in the West, mostly in the United States. So neo-Nazis, white supremacists, 3%ers, these sorts of hate groups that came to sudden prominence after January 6th, but which have been a part of American life for a long time. And what we were trying to do is say, like, hey, what if anything do armed groups have in common across these different contexts? And can we think about these armed groups, these militias, as being on a spectrum without assuming or reductively saying that, the United States and Yemen are somehow exactly the same or very similar, just to say, hey, armed groups that challenge the state and operate outside the control of the state must have something in common. What is it? What is in common? How do they interact with, in effect, and learn from each other? How are they on a continuum? And it was really surprising to me how resistant these incredibly smart colleagues of mine were to making those comparisons at first. So there was a lot of sort of hesitation. So you would ask, what can we learn by thinking about, the Houthis in Yemen and these January 6 groups? And the first response was to say, like, we can't even talk about those as the same kind of group. And so there was a kind of exceptionalism that went both ways, right? So folks who were steeped in the MENA context would say, like, well, like we're not being essentialists and saying these places are doomed to conflict, but really the conditions are so unique in country X that to compare them to another place would be silly. But then these same people would very comfortably compare, let's say, Yemen to Lebanon or Iraq to Yemen. But when you ask them to compare Iraq to the United States or the West to the Middle East, they initially didn't want to do it, but over time they did, and were able to learn quite a bit, both about how armed groups operate and also how we could do a better job studying and thinking about armed groups by using the techniques that, let's say, we've developed studying ISIS to also study groups like the neo-Nazis in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, this reluctance that you talk about, Thanassis, perhaps we can use that to talk about something that was, I think, a general sort of theme across our conversations. And I think one is around, one thing that I think this example speaks to is how these sort of area-based silos can really, shape our thinking and what we consider to be problems to look at and what we just end up not looking at all. And the other thing is, I think there was across the working group sometimes a reluctance to engage in speaking across context, shall we say, because of a fear of losing granularity and a fear of, people have spent years developing often expertise in whatever the field is, and whether it's in an academic form or otherwise, and have too often seen the dangers of policy that misunderstands local context, So there was often that reluctance. But I think that what the groups ended up doing and what we were looking for was not really about losing granularity and making surface level comparisons, right? It wasn't that type of comparative exercise. We weren't looking to split things into typologies or that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, very, very ecumenically asking, what can we learn by thinking about this problem in these two different contexts? And the answer could be nothing, right? We learn nothing, or maybe we learn something very tactical, like we should be careful about how much store we put in what we learn from social media, right? So you can learn some kind of technical thing, or you might, as we did in the militias group, learn that some of the techniques used to harness, let's say, male fears about females gaining social power. We see militias in vastly different contexts harness that to cultivate loyalty from armed group members and weaponize that to use as violence in policing, in policing communities that they're trying to take power over. So you can find these very technical insights, these very literal insights across context.
Yeah, and in the militias group, you spoke about how there was perhaps an exceptionalism that went both ways. I think, though, perhaps across the working groups, a lot of the participants in our working groups are quite, critically minded people and so on. And I think that for most people who work on the Middle East in some sort of critical capacity, they're quite used to seeing the Middle East in its global context. It's somehow hard not to. So they're used to, if they want to see what the factors are, what the context of an issue is, they might consider that context in a global sense. Whereas somebody working on something in Europe or the US, it might not occur to them to consider that the context actually has global factors.
And maybe that's a useful pivot to move to the next group that we spent that we worked on, which was the gender and sexuality working group. And so what you just said was actually one of the first sort of findings and interesting insights that came out of this group, which is one of the members pointed out that if someone is studying phenomena, any phenomena in the United States, the title of their book would be cloth merchants. But if they were studying cloth merchants in Saudi Arabia, it would be the cloth merchants of the Gulf. So there's this unnoticed almost centrality of the West in the study of literally everything. So if you're studying it somewhere else, it's democracy in the subcontinent, democracy in the Arab world. Whereas if you're looking at democracy or democratic erosion in the U.S., it would just be democracy and its erosion. And the other thing that you mentioned a minute ago, which immediately got me thinking about the gender group as well, is the sort of justified but sometimes frustrating reluctance of people to go out of their comfort zone with what they know really well, and gender was one of the really interesting ways in which that manifested in the militias group. Right, in the militias group, we just because we had a gender group didn't mean we couldn't talk about gender in other groups. And when you're talking about militias in our time, gender comes up all in tons of ways. And so, one of them was the ISIS, the quote unquote ISIS brides phenomena, right? Where women went to join ISIS, and they were an entirely different vocabulary was applied to them as if they weren't volunteers for a violent jihadi group. So the men who did it were, jihadis, but the women were ISIS brides, as if because they were female, they had no agency, and then of course, when it came time to strip them of citizenship, they went back to being national security threats. And that was something that also, in a well-meaning way, a lot of our group members didn't want to stray outside of their disciplinary framework, right? So if they were people who thought about hard security or who thought about the recruitment of fighters, they didn't want to go outside of that out of that boundary.
Well, also stay tuned. We do have a podcast episode on militias and gender, so stay tuned for that. And I think that it, as you say, Thanassis, it did come up quite a lot, whether we're talking disciplinary boundary or area that someone is used to, but it also comes up with gender quite a lot in general, right? In all fields. Like, oh no, maybe ask the women. You get a gender question, it's like, oh, ask the women. And I think that one of the things that the participants in the gender working group insisted on, and indeed, like you say, not just because there's a group looking at gender, it means that we're not considering gender across the board. One of the things that they really insisted on is that gender, and as feminists long have, is not really just about women, and that sexuality is not about LGBTQ plus people, but that sexuality, it was about bringing, a queer or LGBTQ plus and straight sexualities into the same analytical frame, and similarly around gender. And that was something that group really insisted on. And it really deepens our understanding across context as well.
And that played out in the gender group. Just one other sort of central finding of them of that group is how the group looked at the ways in which moral panics, which are sort of politically orchestrated hysterias against some vulnerable group, are often, like in the culture wars in the U.S. or like in some of these sex panics that you'll go into in later editions of this podcast in the Middle East and in Europe, are used as sort of test runs for authoritarian or anti-democratic processes that once trotted out against some vulnerable group are then wielded against the population at large. And it was fascinating to me to realize how almost the exact same techniques are used in completely different contexts. I mean, in authoritarian states and democracies by, traditionalist modernists, they end up following an almost identical playbook in harnessing these moral panics for political power. And that was one of the really interesting transnational insights that came out of this project.
Yeah, we end up discussing moral panics a lot, which do a bunch of things, including, as you say, being a test run, enabling the kind of development of coalitions. And we've seen across the globe this idea that gender ideology is some threat to society. So the way in which we gender and sexuality becomes a kind of lightning rod.
Our third group was looked at police accountability, and we had talked about this a little bit at the beginning of our conversation today, Naira. The global moment where this issue was peaking once again really cast a light on how tough and persistent this problem has been to solve. It's incredibly apparent when you start looking transnationally that police accountability and also torture by state security forces has been almost impossible to resolve in almost every context. So whether we're looking at wealthy, advanced, developed democracies with really well-established rule of law, institutional checks and balances, and all the sorts of structural benefits enjoyed by countries in Europe and North America, or whether you're looking at secular or religious dictatorships and monarchies around the Middle East and North Africa, the problem of police accountability, police violence, and public backlash against it persists year after year, decade after decade. And to me, that shows that in this transnational analysis shows just how difficult this is to address and how hard it is to find solutions. And a lot of the comparisons and transnational analysis showed, one, that some of these forces that cause the problem are really actually reinforcing each other. So, global industries of police training and interaction actually help deepen some of these problems. And the other thing we see is that there really is a a sort of international response against this that doesn't have to date a real natural home. So there's some reform movements that look at like things like community policing. The members of the group did a really good job of showing ways in which it can often end up perpetuating the problems it tries to solve. But there isn't a sort of obvious or natural solution to this problem, and that's what I think the group identified as sort of ongoing struggle to find ways to propose alternatives to a problematic status quo.
Absolutely. And in terms of returning to what's a sort of ongoing thread in this project and what we've been talking about today, Thanassis, of how do we know what we know, or how do we try and understand these phenomena? Thinking about police, so often conversations and even contestation of police practices might happen within sort of national boundaries. But you've already alluded to, actual existing international links between policing practices globally. And then police reform, the attempt to sort of address those, is also a global industry. So that's something that the group spoke about quite a bit. And then to take community policing as a model, it is actually used across contexts. So we're almost being invited to do a bit of, open our sights to be a little bit more comparative.
And this is a thing that like protest, which we ended with, is there's some really glaring and obvious and fascinating active sort of vectors of action from one region to another. So I'm thinking, like, when I was in Baghdad in 2003, I went to the Baghdad Police Academy, and who was trotting around with a pistol in his pocket to train the police, to retrain the Iraqi police, but Bernie Kerik, the soon-to-be disgraced former police commissioner of New York City, who was later implicated in all sorts of like really just run-of-the-mill like low-level corruption. But this guy, a literal bad cop from the U.S., was being sent to Baghdad, to a place where, by the way, the worst brutality and excesses of the regime hadn't been done by the police, but had been done by the secret police, which was an entirely different institution. But anyway, and then we had, over the next 15 years, all these American service members who went and fought in Iraq and then came back and were given preferential recruitment into the ranks of police forces. So, for good and ill, we had this nexus of war on terror, training Iraqis, Americans picking up practices in these war zones and then coming back and having to adapt them or implement them in community police forces. It very literally illustrates this globalized, so it's not always this obvious, right? Sometimes there aren't these obvious global connections. In this space, like in protests, there are real obvious intersections.
Yeah. I mean, let's turn to protest, which, as you say, in the two regions that we took into the remit of this project, police brutality and border practices have been a lightning rod for protest, and we've seen sort of mass mobilizations of different kinds across the two areas.
Yeah, I mean, that protest is very near and dear to my heart. I spent many years in Egypt, and I wrote a book about the uprising, the 2011 uprising, that ultimately, for now, did not succeed at changing a really terrible dictatorial system. And throughout this decade, I've been struck by two sort of countervailing things. On the one hand, protest movements have really engaged in a lot of intentional learning, right? That so whether we're talking about Iraq or Occupy Wall Street or BLM or you name it, the umbrella protesters in Hong Kong, not part of our project, but also a very prominent movement. These movements really do look at what happens in other places. So they look at what, how other protest movements have contested power. They look at how they've organized, how they've set up their leadership, how they've tried to channel popular demands and so on. So there's this really this really evident effort to draw on the universal or on the experience of others and then localize it into new contexts. And on the other hand, there seems to be this very common thread of, for the most part, these movements, no matter how huge they get or how persistent or how brave, they have tended not to succeed at changing policy or politics. And this goes across really different, like this is true in the United States. It's true in Iraq. It's true in Algeria. It's true in Sudan, these movements often get defeated even when they really build on what they've learned from other contexts, and even when they do succeed at solving problems that previous movements were confounded by, and getting huge amounts of support.
Yeah, we did end up talking quite a bit about learning across protests and the challenges and the shared challenges, indeed, of turning how you turn protests and moments of mass mobilization, which is kind of the sparkly side of a movement, into an actually existing movement. And some of those challenges are shared across contexts. So really, I think at this point, I just have to say, stay tuned for more. We're going to go into more depth into a lot of these things, both in the coming podcast, of which there'll be episodes from across those 4 working groups, those 4 themes we mentioned. And feel free to read any of the thousands of words that Thanassis mentioned earlier.
Yeah, this is a experiment for Century International, where we're doing something we haven't done before by bringing essentially like North Americanists and Europeanists into conversation with our usual type of lineup of people who are focused in the Middle East. And it's also a new experiment for Order from Ashes as a podcast, where Naira is going to be hosting a sort of self-contained season. This conversation today was the first episode, and she's going to lead you through the 4 subjects of our project: militias, gender sexuality, police accountability, and protest. So by the end of this season, you'll have had a similar journey as we had through the questions and thoughts and insights that come from this kind of like crazy and exciting and creative experiment with thinking and rethinking about the connections between the Middle East and Western Europe and North America. Absolutely.
Exciting stuff. Looking forward to it. Thanks for talking with me today, Thanassis. Actually, I'm kind of explaining to our listeners what's coming up and about the kind of framework of this project, which indeed is quite different from what the institution has done before. And we didn't say it's a kind of iteration, it's a newest iteration of previous projects that have been Middle East focused. Anyhow, exciting stuff. Looking forward to it. You've been listening to Order from Ashes, the Century International podcast. I'm Naira Antoun, and I've been speaking with Thanassis Cambanis as part of our Transnational Trends in Citizenship project.
The Order from Ashes podcast has been brought to you by Century International. Our work builds on more than 100 years of commitment to international peace, security, and governance at the Century Foundation. We are independent, critical, and progressive. For more information about Century International's work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We depend on audience feedback to reach new listeners. If you like what you hear, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.